You have tried to be disciplined, not casually, not lazily. You have tried in the way adults try, quietly, repeatedly, with a growing sense of embarrassment each time it doesn't last. You wake earlier for a while. You commit. You remove distractions. You promise yourself this time will be different. And then, without drama, it fades. Not in a single collapse, but in small concessions. One missed morning, one delayed task, one internal negotiation, until discipline becomes something you used to do, not something you are. This is where most people turn against themselves. They call it weakness, lack of will, a broken character. That is not accurate. If discipline were simply force, the angriest people would be the most consistent. If discipline were motivation, the inspired would never relapse. But you already know, this is not how life works. The problem is not effort. The problem is misalignment. You are attempting to impose structure on a self that is internally divided. One part of you wants order, another part wants relief, another wants recognition, another wants silence, and none of them trust each other. So discipline becomes exhausting because it requires constant internal conflict. This is why you feel tired before the work even begins. In Shaolin tradition, this condition has a name, though it is rarely spoken aloud. It is called scattered intent. When intent is scattered, action leaks. When action leaks, discipline collapses, not from laziness, but from friction. You may notice something else, quieter and harder to admit. You do not fail loudly anymore. You fail politely, you still function, you still perform, but there is a dull sense that something essential has been postponed too long, not a dream, an alignment. This is the suffering of capable adults, not chaos, but drift. Shaolin discipline was never designed to motivate drifting people. It was designed to filter them, not by cruelty, by stillness. Before a body was trained, the self was observed. Before effort was demanded, fragmentation was revealed. If the mind could not remain whole in silence, no amount of physical hardship would help. This is where discipline truly begins, not with instruction, but with diagnosis. And the diagnosis is simple, though not comforting. You do not need more pressure. You need fewer inner voices. Until the self is reduced to something stable, discipline will always feel like a self-attack, and nothing cultivated through self-attack lasts. This is not a condemnation, it is a beginning. The fierceness you are searching for does not start with intensity, it starts with removal. High in the mountains, where paths narrow and sound thins, there is a gate that does not look like a test. It is not guarded by shouting monks. There are no demonstrations of strength, no vows spoken, no promises demanded. Most people walk past it without realizing anything has begun. In old Shaolin tradition, this gate marked the true entrance, not into training, but into discipline itself. And those who recorded its function wrote very little about it, because nothing dramatic happened there. The candidate was asked to remain, not to perform, not to endure pain, not to prove devotion, only to remain. Days passed with no instruction, no praise, no correction. The body was fed, the mind was not occupied. This is where most people failed, not because the task was difficult, but because it was empty. The modern imagination believes discipline begins with hardship. Shaolin masters knew better. Hardship can excite the ego, silence cannot. In silence, a different struggle emerges. The mind begins to create urgency, then stories, then doubt, then resentment. What am I doing here? Why am I being ignored? I could be improving somewhere else. The gate did not test strength. It tested containment. Those who could not remain without stimulation were quietly dismissed, not rejected, simply allowed to leave. No shame followed them. The mountain made no comment, because discipline that depends on external structure collapses the moment that structure disappears. What Shaolin sought was not obedience, but settled intent. A person who could sit without instruction, without recognition, without novelty, and still remain whole, had passed the first and most difficult threshold. This is why so few enter deeply. Most people confuse movement with progress. They feel alive only when pushed or praised. They equate intensity with meaning. But Shaolin discipline was never about producing visible effort. It was about eliminating leakage. At the gate, nothing was added. What was removed instead was subtle and unsettling. The need to be seen. The habit of self-entertainment. The belief that progress must feel rewarding. When these were stripped away, one thing remained, either a quiet, stable self, or restlessness without direction. Only the first could continue. If this feels uncomfortable to hear, that is not accidental. You live in a world that constantly pulls at your attention, identity, and urgency. You are rarely allowed to remain unprovoked. So when you attempt discipline, you unknowingly bring this dependency with you. You expect feedback. You expect momentum. You expect confirmation. And when none appears, you interpret stillness as failure. Shaolin saw stillness as truth. The gate was never locked. Leaving was easy. What was rare was the adult who could stay without being stimulated, who did not need to feel progress in order to continue. This is why the fiercest discipline does not look fierce at the beginning. It looks like nothing is happening. And that is precisely why almost everyone turns back. This gate still exists, not on a mountain, but in the quiet moments where nothing pushes you forward and nothing stops you from leaving. Most people walk away without knowing what they abandoned. The path does not chase them. It never did. When people speak of fierce discipline, they usually describe noise, raised voices inside the mind, harsh commands, an atmosphere of battle. They imagine discipline as something aggressive, a force that dominates weakness, crushes hesitation, overwhelms resistance. This image is common because it feels active, and activity feels like control. But in the old traditions, this kind of fierceness was considered unstable. Loud water spills easily. Quiet water cuts stone. Shaolin masters did not trust discipline that required emotional heat. Emotion burns quickly. When it fades, nothing remains to hold the action in place. You may recognize this pattern in your own life. You begin something with intensity. You feel serious. You feel changed for a time. Then life interferes. Fatigue enters. Emotion cools. And suddenly, the discipline that once felt powerful feels heavy. This is not a personal failure. It is a structural one. Discipline built on emotional charge collapses when the charge disappears. Modern culture quietly reinforces this false image. It praises extremes, early mornings, relentless schedules, dramatic sacrifice. These displays look fierce from the outside, but Shaolin did not cultivate appearance. It cultivated continuity. The fiercest monks were often indistinguishable from the rest. Their days were plain, their movements unremarkable, their speech is minimal. What separated them was not intensity, but the absence of negotiation. They did not wake up and ask how they felt. They did not debate whether training mattered that day. They did not dramatize effort. Action occurred the way breath occurs, not because it was forced, but because it was settled. This is difficult to accept for people who have been taught that inner conflict is normal. Most adults carry an internal court of voices. The ambitious one, the tired one, the resentful one, the hopeful one. Discipline becomes the act of letting one voice shout louder than the others. This is exhausting. The Shaolin discipline did not shout. It removed the stage. When there is no audience inside the mind, there is no need to perform. When there is no performance, effort becomes clean. There is a quiet warning here. Any discipline that requires you to convince yourself constantly is already unstable. If you must rehearse reasons, summon emotion, or threaten yourself internally, you are not cultivating discipline, you are managing resistance. Shaolin sought a state where resistance no longer needed management. True fierceness is quiet because it does not argue. You may notice something unsettling here. The kind of discipline you admire, the dramatic kind, often burns people out. They succeed loudly, then vanish, or they maintain an image while eroding internally. Shaolin measured discipline differently, not by how hard one trained in a day, but by whether one could return again and again without resentment. If resentment entered, something was wrong. This is the inversion most people miss. They think discipline is fierce because it hurts. Shaolin is considered fierce because it removes excuses, identities, and emotional bargaining. It leaves no place to hide, not behind intensity, not behind suffering, not behind self-punishment. Only a simple action remains. This is why the fiercest level of discipline does not look heroic. It looks repetitive, ordinary, unremarkable. And because of this, it is terrifying to the ego. There is nothing to celebrate, nothing to post, nothing to prove, only the quiet knowledge that today's action is not different from yesterday's and does not need to be. This is the discipline that lasts, and this is why most people avoid it. Not because it is hard, but because it asks them to lay down the image of who they think a disciplined person should look like. When people fail at discipline repeatedly, they usually respond by adding more rules, more systems, more structure, more pressure. They believe the self is insufficient, so it must be reinforced. Shaolin discipline begins with the opposite assumption. The self is not weak, it is cluttered. In the old cultivation texts, progress is never described as building something new. It is described as refining, clearing, and returning. Impurities are removed until what remains can function naturally, without force. A blade does not become sharp by adding metal. It becomes sharp by removing what is dull. This is the first law, and it is the one most people resist, because removal feels like loss. You are asked to remove habits that comfort you, identities that excuse you, distractions that soothe you, narratives that protect your ego from disappointment. None of these feels optional at first. They feel personal, even necessary. This is why discipline framed as doing more is attractive. It allows you to keep everything else intact. You can add morning routines without questioning evenings. You can add productivity without examining avoidance. Shaolin did not allow this compromise. Before a monk trained longer, he trained less. Before complexity, simplicity. Before endurance, alignment. If something in daily life created agitation, it was removed, even if it looked harmless, even if it was socially acceptable, not because pleasure was forbidden, but because leakage was intolerable. Leakage is subtle. It is the small drain of attention, energy, and intent that leaves you tired without knowing why. It is the feeling of being busy yet unfulfilled, active yet internally scattered. Most adults live with constant leakage and mistake it for normal life. They wake already fragmented. They carry unfinished conversations internally. They rehearse futures they cannot control. They consume stimulation to avoid silence. Then they wonder why discipline feels heavy, why consistency feels like dragging weight uphill. Shaolin did not ask, how can I become more disciplined? It asked, what prevents discipline from arising naturally? The answers were rarely dramatic. Too many words spoken without necessity. Too many opinions are formed without depth. Too much unnecessary movement of the body and mind. Too much attachment to how one is perceived by others. These were not judged as moral failures. They were treated as obstacles, the way mud is treated on a clear path. So they were removed. This is where modern people misunderstand severity. They think Shaolin discipline was harsh because it demanded suffering. In truth, it was harsh because it allowed no indulgence in unnecessary complexity. You did not get to keep distractions simply because they felt normal. You did not get to keep identities simply because they were familiar. You did not get to explain your way out of alignment. If something pulled you away from your center, it was gradually stripped, patiently, repeatedly, without anger. This feels frightening to adults who have built lives around compensation. Compensation for boredom, compensation for regret, compensation for unmet expectations, compensation for the feeling that life did not unfold as imagined. Remove the compensation and discomfort appears. Shaolin did not rush to soothe this discomfort or reinterpret it as failure. They understood something modern culture avoids. Discomfort is not the enemy. Discomfort is information. It shows where alignment has been lost and where attention has been misplaced. When you remove enough noise, something quietly profound happens. You stop needing motivation. Action begins to arise from rhythm instead of pressure. Movement follows structure without argument. You act because there is nothing in the way. This is why discipline based on removal lasts. It does not rely on mood. It does not rely on inspiration. It does not require constant self-management or self-criticism. It is simply what remains when excess has been cleared. This is not an easy process, but it is a clean one. And cleanliness, in Shaolin tradition, was always considered a form of fierceness, not loud, not cruel, not performative, uncompromising. There is a moment in every serious discipline when nothing feels wrong, yet everything feels exposed. This is the moment most people leave, not because the practice is difficult, but because the noise has thinned enough for something uncomfortable to surface. When removal begins to work, the mind loses its usual escape routes. Distraction weakens, stimulation fades, urgency dissolves, and in this quiet, resistance appears. It does not announce itself as fear. It arrives as restlessness, a subtle impulse to change something, to check something, to improve something, to move anywhere, even without reason. Many people misinterpret this as a sign that the discipline is failing. Shaolin recognized it as the opposite. Resistance appears when the mind can no longer hide behind excess. It is the friction of old patterns dissolving, the echo of habits that no longer have fuel. In the mountains, this phase was never dramatized. A student was not told, "Now you will struggle." He was simply observed. Some became irritable. Some became bored. Some began to doubt the path itself. Some questioned the teacher in silence without words. This was expected. The mind that has been fed constantly does not surrender quietly. Modern adults often believe resistance means something is wrong with them. In truth, resistance means something unnecessary is being removed. This is why so many people abandon discipline right when it starts to work. They mistake discomfort for misdirection. When the mind loses stimulation, it attempts to recreate it internally. It revisits old regrets. It amplifies dissatisfaction. It invents urgency where none exists. It replays conversations long finished. This is not insight. It is withdrawal. Shaolin did not treat this phase as psychological drama. They treated it as weather, neither good nor bad, only temporary. It would pass, if not interfered with. Interference is where most people fail. They try to soothe the discomfort. They reintroduce noise. They negotiate with the self. They reward themselves for enduring enough. Just this once. Just until I feel better. Just to regain balance. But balance does not return through compensation. It returns through endurance. Not forceful endurance, but quiet allowance. You stay. You do not explain. You do not dramatize. You do not demand meaning from the discomfort. You let the mind exhaust its complaints. This requires a specific kind of courage. Not the courage to push harder, but the courage to not escape. Adults who have lived full lives find this especially difficult. They have learned to manage discomfort efficiently. They know how to distract themselves without anyone noticing. They know how to appear functional while quietly avoiding stillness. Shaolin discipline interrupts this skill. It does not allow sophisticated avoidance. This is why people with intelligence and capability sometimes struggle more than those with less. They can justify leading beautifully. They can explain why this is not the right time, why conditions are imperfect, why they will return later. But discipline does not respond to explanations. It responds to presence. If you remain long enough, something shifts. The restlessness loses its urgency. The thoughts lose their authority. Silence becomes less threatening, not peaceful, yet but tolerable. This is the threshold most never cross, because the ego prefers agitation to emptiness. It prefers struggle to stillness. Stillness offers no identity, and without identity, the self feels temporarily undefined, almost transparent. Shaolin understood this moment well. They did not encourage students through it. They did not warn them away from it. They did not offer reassurance. They simply allowed it. Those who stayed were not praised. They were allowed to continue. This is the quiet cruelty and quiet mercy of true discipline. No reassurance, no rescue, only the chance to remain. And for those who did, resistance did not disappear. It dissolved. There is a level of discipline that most people never encounter, not because it is hidden, but because it appears empty. At this level, discipline no longer feels inspiring. It no longer feels punishing. It no longer feels personal. Emotion has withdrawn. This is what makes it frightening. Most people rely on emotion, anger, ambition, fear, pride to move themselves. When emotion disappears, they feel empowered, as if something essential has been taken away. Shaolin considered this moment a sign of maturity. Discipline without emotion does not mean indifference. It means non-attachment. Action continues, but the inner commentary fades. You rise, you train, you work, you rest. Not because you feel driven, but because this is the rhythm you inhabit. In the internal arts, this state is sometimes described as stillness within motion. The body moves, but the mind does not chase the movement. Breath flows, but attention does not cling to it. This is Wu Wei inside structure, not passivity, not laziness, but action without strain. Most people cannot imagine discipline without emotional fuel because they have never experienced it. They assume that without pressure, everything will collapse. The opposite is true. When emotion governs discipline, action fluctuates. When rhythm governs discipline, action stabilizes. Shaolin monks trained the same movements daily, often for years, without variation. There was nothing new to anticipate, nothing to conquer, nothing to prove, and yet strength accumulated. This is where modern minds struggle. They seek progress that feels like progress. Shaolin sought progress that survived boredom. At the fiercest level, discipline becomes quiet inevitability. There is no inner debate, no question of whether today counts, no inflation when things go well, no collapse when they do not. You do not need to believe in yourself. You do not need to fight yourself. You simply act. This is terrifying to the ego because the ego feeds on emotional narrative. Without narrative, there is no hero, no victim, no transformation story, only continuity. This is why discipline without emotion feels empty at first. The mind reaches for meaning and finds none. Shaolin did not fill this emptiness with philosophy. They allowed it. Over time, something deeper replaced emotion. Trust, not confidence, not excitement. Trust in rhythm. The body knew when to move. The breath knew when to settle. The day knew its shape. Discipline became like water following a channel. Not because it was forced, but because nothing obstructed it. This is the fiercest level because it cannot be shaken by circumstance. Praise does not strengthen it. Criticism does not weaken it. Fatigue does not negotiate with it. You still feel tired. You still feel doubt. But these feelings no longer govern action. They pass through, unconsulted. This is not numbness. It is stability. Few people reach this level because it offers no emotional reward. It does not make you feel powerful. It does not announce itself as growth. It simply works. And once tasted, the earlier forms of discipline feel noisy and unreliable. Shaolin did not glorify this state. They treated it as ordinary, which may be the most unsettling part of all. Most people believe discipline is a mental act. They try to think themselves into consistency. They argue internally. They reason. They persuade. Shaolin never began there, because the mind follows the body far more faithfully than the body follows the mind. Discipline, in its most stable form, does not live in thought. It lives in posture, breath, and physical rhythm. This is why the internal arts were always considered foundational, not optional. Without bodily alignment, mental effort leaks endlessly. A scattered body produces a scattered mind. A collapsed posture invites hesitation. An unstable breath feeds anxiety and impatience. No amount of intention can override this for long. Shaolin monks were taught to stand, walk, sit, and work in ways that conserved energy and stabilized attention, not to look disciplined, but to become unshakable. Posture was not aesthetic, it was ethical. A spine held upright without rigidity communicates something to the nervous system. Remain present. Shoulders released downward without collapse signal. No need to defend. Feet placed deliberately without haste tell the mind, we are not late. These signals operate beneath language. They do not require belief, affirmation, or emotional investment. This is why people who attempt discipline only at the level of ideas fail repeatedly. Their bodies continue broadcasting urgency, avoidance, or fatigue, undermining every mental resolution. Shaolin corrected the body first. Breath followed. Not controlled aggressively, not optimized, not turned into a performance, simply allowed to deepen and settle. When breath is shallow, action feels urgent. When breath is stable, time widens. This is not a metaphor. It is physiology understood through observation long before modern terms existed. A person who breathes evenly does not rush unnecessarily. A person who stands balanced does not sway internally. A person who moves economically does not exhaust themselves prematurely. Discipline emerges naturally from this state. This is the meaning of stillness within motion. You can lift, strike, carry, clean, and endure while remaining internally unmoved. The body works. The mind rests inside the work. Most adults have never experienced this. Their bodies are tense before the effort begins. Their breath tightens in anticipation. Their posture collapses under imagined weight. They carry urgency even when nothing urgent is required. Then they blame themselves for lacking discipline. Shaolin did not assign blame. They adjusted alignment. When alignment is corrected, effort decreases, even as output remains. This is why elderly monks could outlast younger ones. They did not waste energy fighting themselves, narrating effort, or resisting discomfort. Discipline that lives in the body does not require reminders. You do not need to convince your posture to stand. You do not need to motivate your breath to breathe. You do not need to argue with your feet to take the next step. When daily actions are embedded in physical rhythm, discipline becomes self-sustaining. This is also why neglecting the body undermines discipline quietly. Poor sleep posture, chaotic movement, constant muscular tension, irregular breathing under stress. These leaks willpower faster than any distraction. Shaolin discipline did not separate physical cultivation from ethical cultivation. They were the same practice expressed differently. To stand correctly was to stand honestly. To breathe steadily was to remain truthful under pressure. A disciplined body produces a disciplined life without commentary, not because you force it, but because nothing pulls you away. This is where discipline finally becomes calm, not fragile calm, structural calm, the kind that remains even when the day does not cooperate. At a certain point, discipline stops being something you practice. It becomes something you are. This is where many people misunderstand transformation. They believe discipline requires creating a new identity, a stronger one, a stricter one, a more impressive one. Shaolin did not create new identities. They refined existing ones. In the old cultivation language, this was described as returning to the original shape, not adding virtue, not becoming exceptional, but removing what distorted the natural form. The disciplined person is not someone who forces themselves endlessly. They are someone who has removed the option to negotiate. This distinction matters. Most people experience discipline as a daily decision. Decision requires energy. Energy fluctuates. Shaolin discipline eliminated the need to decide. When action aligns with identity, there is nothing to debate. You do not wake up asking whether you will act correctly. correct action is assumed, the way you assume you will stand when you rise, or breathe when you sit. This is not rigidity, it is clarity. Identity refinement occurs quietly, without declaration. You stop explaining yourself. You stop promising future versions. You stop dramatizing effort. You act in accordance with what you recognize as correct, even when it is inconvenient, even when it goes unnoticed, even when no one benefits immediately. This is why true discipline often appears unimpressive. It does not announce itself. It does not require validation. Shaolin monks were warned against identifying as disciplined. The moment discipline becomes an identity badge, it begins to decay, because now there is something to protect, something to defend, something to perform. Instead, discipline was treated as a baseline, a condition for living, not a trait to display. If you failed, you returned. If you resisted, you observed. If you drifted, you corrected. No self-condemnation, no self-congratulation, only refinement. This is difficult for modern adults because identity has become performative. People curate images of who they are, then struggle to live inside them. Shaolin discipline strips this away. You are not disciplined for something. You are disciplined because it is correct. This removes urgency. There is no finish line, no arrival moment. No future self will finally deserve peace. You live aligned now, imperfectly, repeatedly. And when you fail, you do not interpret it as collapse. You interpret it as information. This is the mature form of responsibility. Not harsh, not sentimental, clear. Over time, something subtle changes. You trust yourself more, not because you feel confident, but because your actions are predictable. Predictability builds integrity. Integrity builds quiet strength. This strength is not loud enough to impress others, but it is strong enough to support a life. This is the disciplined person, not heroic, not extreme, reliable. And reliability over decades shapes destiny more powerfully than any surge of effort ever could. Time does not punish you for being undisciplined. It simply continues. This is what makes regret so quiet. It does not arrive as panic. It arrives as recognition, often late, often without drama. You look back and realize that nothing catastrophic happened. You lived, you managed, you functioned, and yet something essential was repeatedly postponed. Not success, not status, not comfort, alignment. Shaolin never rushed students with visions of the future. They spoke instead of the path, long, repetitive, and largely unremarkable, because the danger was not failure. The danger was drifting while believing you were progressing. Time passes regardless of intention. The body ages regardless of ambition. Habits harden regardless of awareness. Discipline, in this sense, was never about improvement. It was about meeting time honestly. When you live misaligned, time feels like pressure. When you live aligned, time feels like a companion. This is why Shaolin discipline emphasized returning over advancing. You will drift, you will resist, you will fail quietly. These were not treated as moral events. They were treated as part of the terrain, predictable, navigable, ordinary. The disciplined person is not the one who never falters. It is the one who returns without resentment. Return after fatigue. Return after distraction. Return after disappointment. Return after forgetting why you began. Again and again, without ceremony. This is the long path. It does not promise excitement. It does not offer shortcuts. It does not reward impatience. It offers something more durable, a life that does not fracture under its own weight. Regret softens when you know you are walking correctly, even slowly. Anxiety loses its edge when your actions are coherent. You stop demanding that life feel meaningful every day. You allow meaning to accumulate quietly, the way strength accumulates in bone. Shaolin masters did not speak often of legacy, but they understood it deeply. Legacy is not what you leave behind. It is what remains unbroken within you. A posture that does not collapse under age. A breath that steadies under pressure. an action that does not require self-violence, a mind that does not flee from stillness. This is what discipline protects, not achievement, alignment. The path forward is solitary, not because others cannot walk it, but because no one can walk it for you. There will be days when no one sees your effort, days when nothing improves, days when discipline feels invisible, days when returning feels heavier than quitting. These days matter most, because this is when identity holds without reinforcement. You do not need to feel strong. You do not need to feel certain. You do not need to feel inspired. You need only to return. This is not a promise of peace. Discomfort will remain. Doubt will visit. Fatigue will appear. But none of these will own you. You will move through them without argument, without self-attack, without performance, quietly, reliably. This is the fiercest level of discipline Shaolin knew. Not dramatic, not urgent, not heroic, inevitable. And once you recognize this path, there is no need to rush. Time will walk with you, whether you are aligned or not. The choice is simply whether you walk consciously. And if you do, you will find that discipline is no longer something you pursue. It is something you carry lightly, steadily, for the rest of the way.